welcome to the Dibley Diaries for this week. I know I'm possibly at a bit of an odd angle, but I wanted to come to this church building this week in particular because I wanted us to think about uneven steps and stumbling. In the gospel passage, Jesus talks about Peter being a stumbling block for him, and this particular church building has two very, very uneven steps as you come in through the main door of the church building. There is a ramp, so if necessary we can make it a step-free access. We can put that in place, but it's a bigger issue, isn't it? How much should we make it very even and safe for people to come into the church building versus how much do people want to be part of all the people who have put their footsteps in this place on that threshold for nearly 1,000 years. This church building has an additional slip and trip hazard in that it has two large stone memorial tablets placed in the floor of the main aisle, and in the right weather conditions and temperature differences between outside and inside and humidity, they get enormous amounts of condensation on them. It's almost as if the water is weeping out of the stone at that point, and so it becomes very slippery as well. So I have to note to self entering this church building in a hurry, mind the steps which you need to come down as you open the door, and B, don't slip on the potentially slippery other stones. And this is a tension that all rural church buildings face, holding the kind of tension of wanting to be a really safe and accessible place where people can come to worship, whilst also remembering that people have been worshipping in these church buildings sometimes for nearly 1,000 years. This week's thought for the week, we continue in Matthew chapter 16 verses 21 to 28, and it begins with Jesus talking to the disciples, saying that he is going to have to go to Jerusalem, he's going to die and be resurrected, and Peter then goes on to draw Jesus to one side and says, "You can't do that. You mustn't do that. This is not the right thing to do." And Jesus says these remarkable things to him, beginning with, "Get behind me, Satan. Get behind me, Satan. And then you are a stumbling block to me. And then you are thinking of the things of the world instead of the things of God." So it's very interesting, and it's very shocking, the beginning of that statement, so much so that last week when I was talking about it and giving people a little spoiler alert for this week, that one of the congregation actually did a little gasp when we got to me saying, Jesus is going to say to Peter next week, "Get behind me, Satan," and somebody had obviously forgotten that they came so close together and went so yes, that sort of response. What is a stumbling block? How is Peter being a stumbling block to Jesus? It's quite interesting. Only last week in our Bible reading, just a little bit ago, Jesus was saying to Peter, "I'm going to call you the rock because I'm going to build my church on this rock," and then gives Peter the keys to the kingdom of heaven. That's all the good news from last week's reading. And then I wonder if that whole rock thing is connected to that rock not being a foundation, but that rock is then a stumbling block for Jesus, potential for Jesus to trip, a stumbling block. And I always think, when I come to this passage and think about stumbling block, about stairs in castles. I don't know how true this is, but there is some debate about whether sometimes in castles people build stairs, or they used to build stairs, so that one of the stairs was shorter or higher than the other, probably higher, I guess. And then if you were invading that castle, you wouldn't realise that the step was higher, and so you would trip over the step, because it wasn't your staircase. If you were invading, you would stumble there and you would fall. And it was a great defensive advantage because everybody who lived in the castle knew that that was step, but more of not just know in their head, but had a kind of subconscious muscle memory that those steps were uneven and that step would be the step that you could trip over. So Jesus is saying to Peter, don't be a stumbling block, don't be something that is going to trip me up here, because I have things to do. And Peter's saying, you can't do this. You can't do this. You mustn't do this. You can't do this. And that led me to thinking about all the times that people say, you can't do this, you can't do that. Now, in some people, the response which is brought about is that it makes people more determined, you know. People think, well, I can do that. Of course I can do that. Or even, you think I can't do this. Well, I jolly well am going to do this, and I am going to show you that I am going to do this. So those can be really positive responses. But I also was thinking about all the people who are told that they can't do this because because whoever's telling them that, it's part of their own power play, really, or their own kind of wanting to control a situation. People who are told by teachers or parents or authority figures when they're younger, of course you can't do that, actually believe those things about themselves, even if maybe they are not true. And it can really break somebody being told you can't do this, and it is that kind of stumbling block for people that they'll never get past that. When I was a teenager, I had a poster, and I've still got it tucked somewhere in a box, and it's Garfield the cat with his best friend Odie the dog, and they are sitting in the branches of a tree, which obviously they have both climbed, and Garfield is thinking, it's amazing what you can achieve when you don't know what you can't do, because Garfield had encouraged Odie the dog to climb the tree and hadn't said, well, of course you're a dog, you can't climb a tree. So I think about that in this passage when I come to this passage as well. So this week, Peter is getting it wrong. Peter is getting it very, very wrong. Last week, earlier on in the Matthew, Peter was getting it very, very right. It's part of the story, and Peter will continue to get it wrong and right and wrong and right again until that meeting after the resurrection where Jesus forgives him, and there's this discussion about trust and leadership. So all these things, the story continues on of Peter getting it wrong and right and wrong and right. And Jesus, of course, will not let Peter tell him that he can't do this, because he knows he must do this. He knows that God has called him to do this. And by not listening to Peter telling him he can't do it, he goes ahead and he does do it. He does do those things. Admittedly, an unusual plan on God's part, the whole death and resurrection and so on. God's plan to reconcile the world to himself. Jesus goes on to do that, even though Peter tells him that he can't do it. The Dibley moment for this week was not in this church building, but is about a pulpit, a bit like this, which has steps and no handrail, although here at least you can hold on to the edge of the pew a little bit while you're going up if you need to. I was on my last placement before I was being ordained, and I was very heavily pregnant at that time, and the poor vicar of the place where I was preaching, I was 8.5 months pregnant at this point, was very concerned. He said, Janet, please don't trip up the steps as you go up into the pulpit. And I could see this real look of concern on his face. I wasn't sure quite what he thought was going to happen if I tripped up. I wondered if he thought I was going to trip up and the baby was going to shoot out. But he was very, very concerned for me. And to be fair, I did very carefully gather up all my robes so that I didn't trip up, and I went very carefully up the pulpit steps, holding onto the little bit of rope that they had instead of a handrail, because he did not want me to stumble and fall on the way up to that pulpit. That's it for the Dibley Diaries for this week. I pray that you and your village, however large or small, have a really blessed week, and that you won't find anything to stumble or trip over.